I'm Alan Wardis, and this is Think Radio Presents Think People. My guest today is educator Jackie Burt.
It's terribly ironic because outcome-based education doesn't work. You cannot inspire a second grader to learn how to read. You can make them do the drills. You can make them dislike it. You can lead a kid to a book, but you can't make him read.
Think People is underwritten by High Country News, telling the ongoing story of the modern American West. Through in-depth journalism and thought-provoking writing, the magazine has inspired people to act on behalf of the American West for 50 years. Learn more at hcn.org. Welcome
to another great conversation on Think Radio. If you like Think People, then I know you'll enjoy the other shows in the Think Radio Presents family of podcasts. Think Business, a weekly discussion with entrepreneurs, innovators, and disruptors on sustainable business into the 21st century. Think Planet, conversations with thought leaders on important environmental issues. Subscribe to Think Radio Presents on iTunes, YouTube, or wherever else you get great content. And don't forget to help us spread the word by liking our social media channels and sharing the content we post. We're grateful to have you in the conversation on Think Radio Presents. Jackie is the founder and former director of the One Room Schoolhouse, also known as ORSCH. She's a licensed teacher in Colorado and an outspoken advocate for new and innovative models in how we educate our children. To her, that means greater freedom and autonomy for students and teachers alike. It also means breaking structural molds that no longer serve us very well. She's the author of ORSCH, Cutting the Edge in Education, which is a gold medalist in the Independent Book Publishing Awards several years ago. Jackie, I'm really happy to have you in the studio. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's cut straight to the question that I'm sure you get asked often. Well, anybody gets asked about their profession. Why teaching? What made you want to be a teacher to begin with?
I was in first grade when I decided to be a teacher. I was head over heels enamored with my first grade teacher, and
Wow.
She made each of us feel so important, and I loved school. I loved going each day, and I remember fantasizing in third, fourth grades about how I would run a classroom, and it was my pretty much only goal, other than being an author. That was my second love.
So you've done
writing.
both of those.
Yes,
Awesome.
yes. In fact, they were a simultaneous project, really. I intended to write about all my experiences in teaching from a very early age, and have been doing so for a long time.
So thinking back to that first grade perspective, what was it about being in the classroom then that you loved so much?
Many things. I loved learning. I loved the social aspect. I loved feeling like I was important to a teacher and classmates. I've always been fiercely independent. You could ask my husband, my children.
Or anyone who knows you,
Yes.
by the way.
And, even back then, I feel like that was an important phase for me to be respected as an individual. And I recognized it and decided it was what I wanted to help others do. And then my parents moved pretty much every year and a half of my life. So throughout my school career, I was able to experience a ton of different teaching types, different teachers, different school structures. And I feel like I was analyzing it the whole time and really putting together what I thought would be a magic recipe.
Did you ever pass through that typical moment that most kids experience where you thought, I hate school. I never want to have anything more to do with school ever again, period?
I have to be honest and say, no, I didn't.
You were one of those kids?
I was one of those kids. But
oh my gosh.
Interestingly, with a creative flair. But I never had to because I moved so much. Nothing got stagnant. I was able to change it up. I did go through moments of having a terrible social moment or two or three and want to leave school, but then I buried myself in school work instead.
Yeah, you can't be a kid without having
Yeah.
moments like that.
Right. And that was important as well, because I knew firsthand how difficult that part can be, or how much, it matters in the success of a student. But I was lucky enough, if things went really badly or had gone really wrong, I knew I was moving in the next 9 months, so it didn't matter much.
Oh, you had a trap door. That's not fair.
Yeah, it was a pretty good advantage.
Well, I find it interesting to think about teaching through that lens of what it was like to be a kid in school. Because sometimes by the time you get to be an educated, licensed teacher, you've sort of forgotten about that, right? But to be able to put yourself back in those little sneakers and think about that. So the things that you were experiencing and loving about being a first grader, was that your ambition to bring that forward into the classroom as a teacher?
I think it was part of it. Yes, and my love for children. As I grew and knew I wanted to teach, I went straight to college to get my license. I remember I went to college here in Gunnison, and I would ride my bike by Blackstock Elementary while I was in college, and I'd see kids on the playground, and I yearned to be with them, sort of like you might yearn for a birthday cake at the end of your birthday party, or just something. I really desired it. So as I got into learning about teaching in my adult years, I really started to, think about things from an adult perspective and how I could bring that zeal to kids. And even when I taught in the public school, that was a focus. And truth be told, I think I just relate to children really well, and that allows me to see their education through their eyes.
Why do you think that is? Because not all teachers can say that.
Yeah.
Why you? Why do you think you can say, I relate to children?
Well, I know and have given plenty of thought to the reason I love children as much as I do. And it's because they have more integrity than most adults.
And what do you mean by that?
They think what they want to think. They say things how they are. They are just authentic beings.
They feel what they feel.
Yeah. And the only time they don't is when they're stifled or when they're scared, or when they're oppressed, and that happens quite frequently. But a child in his or her natural habitat is a beautiful, authentic, deeply full of integrity, deep, kind of person. Mm-hmm. So, and especially when they are with a person who, and they sense it. They know if you trust them as a person and are willing to let them be themselves, then they are pretty incredible people.
Well, we're kind of jumping ahead here, but let's go, because you've just shared a couple of words in this phrase that I think is very interesting when applied to children. Natural habitat. We talk about that with wildlife, bunnies and
Yep.
and bald eagles.
Yep.
But we rarely think about that in terms of our children.
Yes.
What's a natural habitat for a child in your mind?
It's a place where they can be themselves. It's a place where they are celebrated for the individuals they are, both by their peers and their teachers. It's a place they can think outside of the box and problem solve and create, whether it's a product out of paper and glue or a new system to push their chair into the table. Or they're
and they do
incredibly
that sort of
creative.
Yeah.
So they need a lot more thinking space than they're given in traditional education. They need a lot more time space than they're given in traditional education. And so their natural habitat is a place where their timing and their thinking can be governed by them. And it's a tough place for traditional educators, especially anyone who doesn't know a child super well, and because so many generations. This is my theory. So many generations of parents, educators have gone through their own experience of orderly classrooms and chairs and rows. And that's what their experience is, and that's what it's supposed to be. And children should be seen, not heard, and all of those old
those
terrible
things
ideas
that are part of our traditional heritage, right?
So yes, for our history has done a great job of oppressing young minds, and so it's hard to break out of that habit. It's hard to break out of the mold that you are so used to. Even running ORSCH, I had parents question, whether or not their kids would test appropriately and things like that. And even though they chose ORSCH and they chose a creative approach for their kids, they were still tied down, to their traditional mindset of thinking because they'd gone through it.
Right, it's what we know. And so, but let's back up just a little bit, because you've been an outspoken, vocal critic of what you're calling the traditional educational environment for kids. And ORSCH was your attempt to sort of reimagine it. Let's start with, what precisely did you object to as a teacher in a public education classroom that you started to see, wait a minute, this can be done better? What were those things that made you say, we have to do this differently?
Excellent question. And I actually would love to back up from the word critic of, simply because there's a lot of great going on. And, my experience speaks to that. I loved school. And I had one child of my own who adored school. I called her the workbook kid. And then I had, my other child, Sam, was an ORSCHer through and through. So there's a lot going well. So it's not as much as critic of. It was for me more what can be done. There's a lot we're not doing.
Well, that's an interesting point. You don't have to be critical of something in that sense of that word to imagine how it could be better.
Yeah.
So back to my question then. What were those things that you looked at and said, not only can this be better, but it's really important that we make it better. Yeah. It's almost imperative that we make this better. What were those items?
It started, ORSCH's genesis was, I worked in the Gunnison Community School. I worked with Robin Tudor in the Gifted and Talented program. And so I had kids from grades 1 through 5 come to my classroom and Robin's classroom for their gifted education, for a half an hour of reading and or a half an hour of math each day. And in that position, Robin and I got to be super creative, because that's what, quote, gifted kids need. Air quotes, gifted kids. And that program was a blast. I had so much fun doing that. And it was there that I learned what could be. When you crack open a gifted and talented idea book that's created for teachers, it's exactly what kids need.
All kids.
Exactly. And the genesis of ORSCH was, I would see these kids for a half an hour or an hour per day. They would leave my room and go back into their regular classroom, and I questioned that. I saw 5% of the kids. That was, a number we were supposed to stick to, the top 5% of kids. And 95% of the kids would walk by my door, peer in, we'd be...
What's going on in there?
We'd be, creating a movie or a video or cutting out our multiplication tables instead of... just writing them down.
So, doing flashcards.
All of those things, all the things kids love to do in a creative approach to education. And I literally sat there one day and asked myself, why couldn't this serve every child? And that was the genesis for ORSCH.
How did that feel to realize that you were leaving out so many kids?
Exactly. That was the push. That was really the push. And then I had my own children and their friends who would come to my classroom and just thrive there. And they gave me feedback, oh, I don't want to leave. It's already 1:30. It's time to go to lunch even, or at recess, and they didn't want to leave. They thrived in that kind of creative education. So I got to test it there and really develop the ideas there. And I wanted to bring it to more kids. There's no reason in the whole world. I can't fathom why we don't bring that to 100% of our students. And then...
Well, to be fair, let me jump in there and say, I can hear some educators who might say, well, that sounds great. The reason that worked for you, Jackie, was because you only had 5% of the kids coming through your program.
Sure. When
you're dealing with a classroom that's got 25, 26, 28, 32 kids in it, how do you go about creating what you have referred to as creative space and time space and just this general atmosphere of freedom when you've got benchmarks to hit?
Enter ORSCH.
Yes, okay. So how did you solve those problems?
Couple of ways. I am a huge advocate for multi-age. And what I did in ORSCH was something I have often referred to as extreme multi-age. We had a second grader, not reading yet, going to science with the 7th and 8th graders. So that's an example. And that kid thrived in those, moments, even though he couldn't read yet. So benchmarks, you ask about benchmarks. In order to do, and that was one of the big criticisms of what I was doing from the more traditional mindset, was that I wasn't hitting, quote, benchmarks or standards necessarily. I wasn't targeting them. And you can't. I mean, that's one of the flaws currently in our system and in traditional education, is that the idea that all third graders, all 8 and 9-year-olds should be at the same level in May, identical. That's the sameness that doesn't work with what I tried to do.
Well, and that's what professional educators call age norming. What's the variation that you've seen in kids in what they're actually ready to do at a certain age versus what the textbook says they should be able to do?
It's astonishing. The variation is astonishing. I mean, you've got 20% of the kids excelling beyond it. You've got maybe, and the bell curve needs to be redrawn for this particular topic. The middle portion is where the target really is, where standards try to aim. I would guess is we're hitting 10% of kids. I think the from my studies, from what I experienced, from the experiment that ORSCH was, the norm, air quotes again, norm, is the exception to standards. And then that brings in the testing conversation. And
it also brings in the question of what do you do with the kids that are on the edges. From that top 20%, you take 5 and put them in a gifted program.
Right.
What happens to the kids that are testing below the accepted standards for that grade, and they're just not ready?
No.
That's all. Those kids get put into a different sort of program, don't they?
Yeah, it's tragic.
And
in
what's
my opinion.
What's the consequence of that in your experience?
Behavioral issues, hating school, social issues, everything that kids complain about. And so back to the idea of, so I wanted to do this with 100% of the population. That's exactly what ORSCH was. It was my hypothesis, and it was risky. It was scary. But my hypothesis was that with a structure that allowed, and that was scary too, because I did not know what that looked like, not even on day one.
That's like a non-structure in some ways, right?
They had to teach me,
yeah.
to be completely honest. That I had to open up and allow for that. But if your objective is to meet 100% of the needs, and you just completely break the mold and throw out your traditional thinking or your traditional approach, then you realize, which I did, which the project taught me, was that children are absolutely, completely capable of choosing the appropriate levels for where they are. They're capable of a love of learning, finding a love of learning. They're capable of managing their time. They're capable of making good choices. And it's magic. It happened.
Okay, hold on. Because I've raised kids, and when you say to me that you discovered that these kids are in fact capable of managing their time, they're capable of setting their own levels. Mm-hmm. Wow, that is so far outside of our typical way of thinking about this.
Right.
And I say we because I think it's true. Collectively, most people would answer that no, kids have to be pushed. They have to be motivated. They have to be fit into a structure that trains these things into them. But you're telling me it's organic. It's there to begin with. If you just leave them alone?
No, that's a key question. No, you don't leave them alone. That would be, Lord of the Flies. So
okay, well, thanks for that.
Back to the natural habitat. They need, rather than a push, they can need a nudge. Some more than others. Some kids more than others. Mm-hmm. But yes, sometimes they need a nudge or a basket of ideas to get them going, or a snack, or one quick game of Foursquare, or there's a whole array of things that can get them back on track and keep them going. You don't just show up at 9 o'clock and say, "Kids, go learn." That doesn't work.
Right.
They need inspiration. They need appropriate choices. They need the appropriate amount of choices. For example, 10 different math activities doesn't work. And this is all part of the testing and what we got to discover. But 4 to 5 is a great number.
And if one set of activities that traditional education says is appropriate for second graders is being done by fourth grade age kids today, that's okay?
Absolutely.
There's nothing wrong with that?
Oh, it's
You're not
key.
worried they're falling behind?
No, it's key. I mean, think of your own learning and your own thinking. I work with a girl now. She's just so much fun and lovely, and she is learning grammar from me. She's always wanted to use grammar appropriately. We'll be writing emails back and forth, and she'll say, "Did I say this right? Did I use the right effect?" And so we are all learning third grade things still.
Sure.
And no, it's about windows, and it's about when you are ready to learn something, and when it strikes you, and when it's meaningful to you.
And when you have a reason.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so you talked about this young kid, I think you said second grade, going to science with kids that were 5 or 6 years older. And yet he couldn't read. What allowed you the confidence to say, that's okay, relax. We don't have to pull that kid out and spend our time and his time getting over the fact that he's not a reader yet?
That's an excellent question. I think that, again, seeing life seeing a day through the kid's eyes, he would walk by 7th grade science and I'd see him listening in. I mean, I witnessed it. I would see him listening and popping in for a conversation and on the playground talking to 12-year-olds about what they were doing. And it was obvious to me and to his science teacher that he could hang with concepts at that level. So, we knew reading was tough, and we knew that was his biggest challenge throughout the day. So why shove a child who could otherwise be inspired and ignited about an educational topic? Why deny him that and force him into what is only a challenge all day long? It was easy for me. It was easy for us to decide this kid needs to be excited about a subject matter. And then that leads to, I want to learn more about frogs,
So here's a book about
Hopefully,
frogs, and now the
yeah.
kid wants to read it.
Yeah. So I think the inspiration is more important than the benchmark. There's a lot I think is more important than benchmarks.
And yet here's where you run up against some of those structural things that you've referred to. Because the only reason you were able to do that and experiment in this way was because it was your school.
Yeah. It was fun.
Yeah. But we're back to trying to understand all of the well-meaning effort that goes in every single day in public school buildings.
Yeah.
These are talented, dedicated, hardworking, well-meaning, lovely people. Underpaid, let's not forget that. These are administrators who have mandates that are almost impossible at times to fill. And their funding is tied to whether that second grade kid demonstrates the ability to read. How did we get here?
It's terribly ironic because outcome-based education doesn't work. You cannot inspire a second grader to learn how to read. You can make them do the drills. You can make them dislike it. You can lead a kid to a book, but you can't make him read.
And yet here we are pushing on second graders in the millions.
Tied to funding.
And listen, that's not just teachers. That's parents sitting at home every night, sweating blood because they're terrified. They've been told to be terrified that their second grader isn't meeting the norm.
Right. The structure is not an appropriate habitat for youth. It's just not. And the focus on benchmarks and outcomes and test scores eliminates so many important things too, because the focus and the time goes toward that. It's the resources go towards meeting these benchmarks. But meanwhile, we've got scared, lonely, unhappy children popping around schools sometimes. There are plenty of kids who love school, and that's great. And but I don't understand the logic of not first meeting the social emotional needs of a child. I think that any educator knows that a happy, well-adjusted child is going to learn better. So start there.
Right.
And I feel like we have it all backwards.
Well, and it's kind of a chicken and the egg sort of argument too, because if the kids are all unhappy, then what do? When you put them in close proximity in a classroom all day, they kind of, make life miserable for each other.
They do.
And that just, in your experience, was that something that sort of, I won't say went away because we're talking about human beings here, but was that helped in ORSCH classrooms where you saw less bullying, less strife between kids just because they were able to do more what they wanted to do?
Significantly more. That was the best thing. If you talk to any ORSCHer, those were some of the best years of their lives. They loved school. They didn't like Friday afternoon. They didn't want to go home. Yes, and I attribute that to a few things. Probably the main aspect was their own sense of individuality. Little Mr. Second Grader was as proud as could be, and that was his thing, and he was respected for that, and he was known for that, and that allowed him to hold his head up high and go running around being somebody special. And we had lots of key things. We didn't, similar to, you don't just show up and say, go learn. We had lots of key tools and strategies to help bring out individuality. For example, costume contests for things like Valentine's Day. You show up in a completely pink painted face as a 7th grade boy, and you're strutting individuality. That
Absolutely.
kind of thing. So anytime we could pinpoint or celebrate somebody's individuality, we did, and I think that went a long way toward their happiness in school. Even to the point of pointing out how they did it wrong and laughing about it. Surviving failure with a smile is a key piece of life. And so individuality was probably the most powerful element to a good social community. And then another one is that kids enjoyed their time at school so much that they would self-govern. They didn't want somebody messing up their classroom time. They didn't want somebody taking time away from the teacher. And we had our share, of course, of kids who were disruptive or needed a talking to. But it was the students who governed them more than the teachers, because their peers valued their time and their space and their community. It was incredible to watch. I didn't predict that. I really didn't. I knew I wanted individual students to feel happy and love learning, but the community aspect that ORSCH, that blossomed in ORSCH, blew me away. Yeah.
So what were you hearing from parents? What was their feedback? What were they seeing in their kids?
The main feedback from year one was they won't stop talking about school. And it was great.
In a positive way.
Yes,
Some kids won't stop talking about how much they hate it.
They won't stop talking about school. And because I do not believe in homework firmly, they had the time to talk about their days, not struggle through a math assignment.
Right.
And so I would hear from parents, so such and such happened yesterday. Yep, and whether it was experiments or a novel we were all reading together. By the way, that's a key piece of community too, is to have shared experiences. And I chose to read a novel aloud for that one. But and it was interesting because year one I had lots of parents wanting to volunteer, thankfully, because I was by myself.
It was year one.
I was one teacher with 22 kids. I couldn't even use the restroom during the day. I was alone. But then as year 2 and 3 came in, I had less and less parent volunteer hours coming in, and I analyzed that a bit, and I determined, whether I'm right or wrong, I'm not sure, but I determined that they knew their kids were safe and happy and didn't feel the need to come in.
Yeah, in year one, it was less volunteering and more oversight, maybe?
Yes, exactly.
That's interesting. What did you hear and have you heard from other teachers who didn't have the ability to start a one-room schoolhouse like you did? They're still in the public schools. What are they telling you about your ideas?
Well, it depends who it is. I have a few really dear friends who have confided and said, I wish I could have done it. I wish I could afford to come work for you. And then, of course, there's the other side of the coin, those that wanted to kick me out of town.
Well, back to what we said early on, and that is it's tradition. This is the way it's always been done. Don't mess with it.
Yeah. And I think that's threatening. One of the early meetings I had, I wanted to bring this program to Gunnison Community Schools. And one of the early meetings I had, one of the administrators said, are you saying we're not doing it right? And it's not, it's impossible to say, let's do it a new way without stepping on some toes and
Right.
those toes interpreting it as you're not doing it the right way.
That's human nature. We're not ever going to get away from that.
So
Well, I'm going to ask you a very unfair question to end with, and it's unfair because we're almost out of time. And the answer to this question, I think, could consume days and days and days of conversation. We would need a lot more coffee, switching to wine at some point, I think. Where do we go from here?
well, my hope lies in innovative teachers, innovative programs. And you don't do innovative things to make kids more miserable. You do innovative, you pursue innovative ideas for the benefit of students.
Right, and yourself.
And your staff, and they are seeing the effects. There's no doubt in my mind. It's happening all over the place.
So this is happening, just one classroom at a time. Maybe.
Yeah, and one school at a time. And so my hope lies in them seeing some of the stuff I sort of got a crash course in, and continuing to think outside of the box and continuing to serve students above benchmarks and standards, and help them love learning and love coming to school and all those great things we want for our kids.
Well, I think that's an incredible place to stop.
Okay.
I always love stopping with the word hope. Jackie, thanks for your ideas and for your hard work on behalf of children.
Thanks for allowing me to talk about ORSCH.
Thanks for watching. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.